All right, so Venus is the second planet from the sun in the solar system that we know of. And it's often compared to Earth as it's known as the Roman goddess of love and empathy, well, beauty rather. But what's really interesting though is despite it having much similarities to that of the sun or that of Earth rather, there's definitely a lot of stuff that has changed in its history that has turned it into something completely different than it once was. And I would say Venus, as of between Mars and Venus, are probably the two most important, planets trying to figure out our origins, if we are really from this planet, not from Venus, but at the same time though, it does make me think, if these planets never would have died the way they did, could they have had life on them, kind of like human life like? And so it really is an interesting scenario to keep going back to. So hopefully with a planet like this, here there's bound to be some mysteries that you probably don't even know about it. So here's 10 things you probably don't know about Venus. Okay, so number 1, Venus was originally like Earth. It had waters, it had, a planetary atmosphere that could support life much like ours, but if you want to go like the route where you say that maybe aliens aren't necessarily like us, where they could technically be the complete opposite and they could still survive somehow, like bacteria that can survive hot temperatures or bacteria that can survive negative temperatures, cold-blooded versus warm-blooded. But whatever way you look at it, Venus is definitely a planet that, as of right now, due to its condensed atmosphere and sulfuric acid, of course, which is really dangerous to humans, and it even would melt machines, believe it or not. That stuff is strong. It's like the stomach acid in your stomach, but maybe Venus is a sulfuric acid. It's not as strong, but it's still strong, though. I mean, the problem with Venus is that it had too much bad luck within its last life. Something hit it, changed its orbit, its, greenhouse gases took control of it, and it just basically, whatever was there is gone now, basically. It's basically a desert that, it's very, 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 very different compared to Earth now, which is ironic compared to it being called its sister at one point. So something could have, kind of like a second extinction. I think this is like probably, the more I think about it, the most accurate way to put it. I mean, a bunch of scientists have stated before that something crashed into its planet. It stopped its rotation and somehow started reversing it. What also happened was, because it didn't have a strong magnetic field, something must have hit it so bad. Again, maybe something from the, asteroid belt, because again, Jupiter probably pushed it out of its atmosphere. Jupiter's done a lot of strange things because of its big, huge planetary, pressure and all that. But anyways, so something hit Venus many years ago, caused it to stop its planetary orbit, or rotation rather. So it's like it moves counterclockwise instead. Other planets move clockwise, or whatever way it is. It's one or the other. But Venus does the opposite. And so what ends up happening is the planet itself did also have like a runaway gases, and it caused the planet to eventually just evaporate. Everything has a melting point, if you didn't already know this, and everything has a freezing point. Venus's atmosphere could actually melt blocks of lead. It's actually very interesting. That's how strong Venus is. You would die on Venus in like less than 11 seconds or something like that. And what's even really strange is there has been attempts by the Russians, and they did this back in the 80s, where they actually landed a probe on the surface. It was there for maybe roughly an hour, well, maybe 11 hours too. But they lost contact with it very shortly. I think it was like an hour and a half or something like that. And it melted. And then whatever was there, it just melted completely. So, but they were able to transmit signals back in 1982, I believe. Or was it 70s? So somewhere around there. And they managed to show off, like, just, it looks like a desert wasteland just from head to toe. But it's like so, it looks like one's like hallucinating because of how dense and thick its atmosphere is. Very interesting. So whatever's there is gone now, and if it does still exist, it would be in its core somewhere. But even then, that sulfuric acid probably, like groundwater, might have found a way to trickle into it. It's just the way it is. So very interesting indeed, actually. But what's really strange is because it has a lot of similarities to Earth, but because it could have had life on it in the sense that, you know, maybe the greenhouse gases got to the plants and that's why the plants died. Because what's really interesting is it has 96% carbon dioxide, you know, it's carbon and oxygen, right, basically. And basically plants could have taken care of that. If we can get rid of like the sulfuric acid, if we were to terraform the planet, I guarantee you that would be the easiest way to save that planet if we wanted to venture out there and go see it. You know, it basically would be the easiest way to get rid of it. But you'd also have to take care of the density, and you would have to purify the temperature too, and get rid of that sulfuric acid, because that stuff is going to be what kills everything. But if it is possible to save that planet, then we basically would have to, or better yet, create something that can survive it, and then we could just go there and see what's there, you know, if there is anything there. It would be interesting, you know, just to say, hey, you know, we got more information on it. But basically, you know, yeah, that is proof that the atmosphere of Venus is very similar to that of Earth's, but, you know, due to climate, not climate change, but, you know, due to, you know, elements, and it's, you know, because the universe is a strange place indeed, due to different types of, you know, differentiations, cause and effects actually caused it to do what it did, basically. I mean, recently, you know, they actually were able to figure out within the Venus core and all that, and as well as its surface when they landed on it, that, you know, there was active volcanoism, and that just basically explained, like, it was no different than like 300, 600 year old, and it's got very few, not the whole planet, but like, you know, like that layer of the surface. And what's really interesting is, so that was like relatively young still, but at the same time though, we also had evidence to believe that the universe was, or Venus actually had very few impact craters, also demonstrating that there's still a lot of stuff. If it wasn't melted, it would have been, you know, it wasn't like Mercury and the moon, for example, where, you know, it basically was just demolished by like its geology, you know, things shrinking. But basically things melting on Venus is basically the whole nother story, you know, aside from it being frozen, like maybe like the ice planets, like further out. But Venus obviously is even more ridiculous. Like, it doesn't even need the surface of the sun. But like, based on some of the pictures I've been able to find, for example, like, because its atmosphere is so dense too, you can also see like you can see the sun just hovering over its atmosphere and its geology. It's actually really interesting. So life on Venus has been speculated by a lot of people, but it also goes back recently as far as like Carl Sagan's, like about like 50 years ago, or even 60 years ago, because Carl Sagan, as well as Harold, I try to remember the last name, they've all speculated that people believe that there was life on the planets because of extreme acidophilies, more presumably the you can find it in the core, or not just the core, the surface, the clouds and all that. They believe that might be where the bacteria is living right now, and it's not necessarily you know, having any trouble staying afloat up there, and it's also not having too much trouble, you know, existing right there, because, you know, bacteria is small. Therefore, it's light, and it can basically find its way. It could probably manage to stay in the clouds, because maybe dust particles manage to subtract it. You know, obviously humans are subjected to higher weight, so we couldn't necessarily live up there unless we built like some sort of like Leviathan, or, you know, some sort of like, I'm trying to think of the word, like, basically like a big giant space station, or something that could create like some kind of something that keep it afloat, rather, you know, something like anti-gravity, or some sort of like a space station, or a big diatomic disk or something, if that's even the word, diatomic atmosphere. It's interesting to think about, to think that other people were speculating even before it really became a popular norm that maybe other planets had life on it, because bacteria can be found even in all strangest places because they all evolved differently. Venus has more volcanoes than just about any other planet that we've discovered so far. Maybe to the point where that explains why it has very few erosion. Well, it has a lot of erosions, meaning like the ground moves and all that. And so it causes all sorts of like different, sea level, like where you're standing, higher elevations, lower elevations. Basically, it explains why it's able to crystallize, basically, or erode the surface, and therefore there's very few impact craters, because whatever hits Venus, it just basically fixes it, and then it just, it's there. So it just moves things along, and it replenishes it as it goes. So a lot of the density that Venus has had might also be because of the infrared radiation that got absorbed with the carbon dioxide. Because you see, what happens is carbon dioxide can absorb specific types of radiation, and that basically, where the carbon dioxide is stored is basically, not the furthest out, but like the most compressed from its surface to its first layer of its atmosphere. So basically, because of this, it's caused such a, it's kind of like it's created like its own gas planet, rather. That's why it's so thick. So even though Venus is technically not really a gas planet, but it might as well be considered one in a way, because it's so thick. It might even be thicker than Jupiter's atmosphere. That might, don't quote me on that, but it kind of should give, like, it's been given some astronomers and even cosmologists a run for their money. Like, you have to have like very specific equipment to be able to land on Venus, let alone it's surviving it to take pictures too. But it's just why you can't just observe it directly, because like even if you could take a telescope that like you could see things and you could enhance it, you can see the planet, but to get into its surface is a whole another story, especially if the planet is like very dense, very contracted with whatever you might suggest it might have. But Venus is so thick in its atmosphere that, one, it's just getting hotter and hotter until it either finds a way to break whatever's left of that, and its density then reverses itself, because then it would just leak out. But if that's not the case, then you're basically talking about a planet that its temperature is just going to continue to rise, so as long as the radiation can keep storing heat. And with its volcanic activities as well, I mean, you're basically talking about, like, it's just finding a way to leak itself out at some point. It's just it's like a kinetic energy effect. It's storing the energy, but eventually it's going to explode, sort of. So basically, bacteria that has been found on Venus would probably most likely be the same bacteria that has been found on this planet, due to, like, if you want to believe that the bacteria came from asteroids, they came from the same asteroid belt that collided with ours. It kind of makes sense. Venus has obviously been hit by asteroids, as well as, this planet's been hit by asteroids. But what's really interesting to think about is it possible that the same bacteria that could have evolved on Venus, humans could have evolved from too? I mean, if you really think about it, it doesn't really sound too far-fetched, because there's more unknown bacteria in our bodies. And if we really are to believe maybe at one point humans could have been from Venus, or maybe they came here, to this planet, it's very possible that would probably be a likely cause if that were true. That's how we could look at it. So to say that life doesn't exist on Venus because of where it's in hospitality now, it's very possible they could have been on this planet then too. If they wouldn't have had gas runaways and radiation and all that, it's basically, it could have existed the way it exists now. And therefore, what we call life and what we call a form of energy would very well treat ourselves to, the same history, so it's proof. That's got to be proof right there that, we're looking at alien life in the wrong aspects. But at the same time, though, we have to really think to ourselves that, like the Fermi paradox has to be wrong to some extent. But at the same time, though, everything that we tell ourselves, we only know so much based on our limitations of not knowing everything in perfection. So you have what is known as lead sulfide and Boole-Smith, trying to think how to spell it, sulfide as well, is what allegedly snows on Venus. So And it's really interesting because even Venus doesn't even have like lightning strikes that they've been able to find. It's actually like, instead of like there being like no electric magnetic field, it's actually like some kind of like, not even just an indignation of some kind. It's it's basically just a completely different atmosphere due to its cycles and its runaway effects that show off like what the galaxy and the planet itself have basically been reduced to. And of course, Venus has what is known as metallic iron core that's anywhere between like 1,200 to 2,400 miles wide in diameter. Or maybe that's the radius, I gotta double check. But basically it's so thick because of all the hardening of like the volcanic activity that it's even bigger than the Earth's core of, based on how its crust and core and its planet revolves around its surface. It's actually possible that Venus might actually be even, not just the thicker atmosphere had a lot to do with it, but a lot of that material like ended up going into the core and causing it to harden as well due to radiation and whatnot. So basically the whole planet is just a radioactive, but in a different sense. You got to really study the elements and the ions to really understand it, but it just goes to show you that a planet like Venus is so thick and highly compressed that everything is compressed about it. The elements, the material. It'd be good to go mine it if we could get on its atmosphere, but at the same time, it'd be like, how do you leave it so fast then? You'd have to break the atmosphere, and then there's the possibility that even if we were to leave the planet, that the material could very well be so, because it's so hot, it would just blow up, because it's way past the melting point and the temperature is so hot that, no fuel would be able to, leave it without being combustible. So that's kind of something to think about. Venus is a deadly planet, but even if you're not touching the sulfuric acid or the metals, the temperature itself would just be too unstable to be able to leave it. And just like a lot of other mysteries that you probably saw coming, there's so much that we still don't know about Venus. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Scientists to this day are still very unsure of what kind of material that the core of Venus is made of specifically, because you can't really just go there, and at the same time they can't really examine it as well. And even for the attempts that they've gotten so far, it's actually only gotten so far. So to really be able to examine deep down within the core of Venus, a lot of it's speculation, but a lot of it has been backed by a lot of, hard evidence. But it's still kind of interesting to think about that we still don't know what kind of material Venus is mostly made of, estimations. It just goes to show you that even in science is always changing, because whether outdated information or new discoveries that somebody was finally able to break through with, and they deserve all the credit they deserve to get. But it's interesting to think that Venus is just one of those planets where, because you can't really just mine it, you can't just land a probe on it, you can't just start digging. It's so hot, it's so concentrated, and unstable, that it basically would just destroy anything that basically we send there. Most things don't have a melting point tolerance that's like higher than 864 degrees Fahrenheit, and then it melts too, versus the sulfuric acid could eat away at it faster too. So you've got different types of rusting and melting capabilities. So it's interesting to think about. It really is. What we don't see, what we don't know, and what we still have to figure out as time goes on. Because if we can figure out what we don't know, it might actually be possible we could figure out like the origins of Venus too. If it's very similar to Earth, then we can really see how much it's changed within its entire life cycle. So hopefully that's something. But until then, there's a lot more questions that we do answers. But again, if you're not subscribed to this channel, please subscribe. If you want to support me on Patreon, the link's in the description. You don't have to if you don't want to, but your donations are always appreciated. I'm going to keep finding more evidence, and I'm going to keep making videos about this stuff, because this stuff is interesting, before these planets get engulfed by the sun or they go flying out of our orbit, and we never know what could have been there.